We have a small but mighty group. I know you can't see anyone but me, but we have you of course sat through the first part of the
Yes.
presentation.
Yep.
Okay, so Elixiana Oliva was the student who asked one of our questions.
Which was an excellent question, by the way. It's something I feel very strongly about.
Oh, thank you. And Elixiana is here. She's a student studying criminal justice. And
Okay.
then we have several people representing the VIPs in Muscatine.
Great.
Sarah Landy, who has hosted President Xi Jinping at her home. And then
Wow.
Krista Regner, she is a program manager for the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. Both have traveled to China many, many times. Krista probably most recently. Only twice, but very recently. Let's say that it wasn't the number. The recency was what I was remembering.
Right.
Nikki Tripp is a member of our sister cities in Muscatine, and we have a person in the back I have not met yet, but she's waving to you as
Okay.
well.
Okay,
And
great.
and then Jeremy is here. He's been running the tech for us. So
Okay.
let me just briefly introduce Larry's background to you and tell you what great things he's been working on. And so we were connected with Larry through the U.S.-China Town Hall or Relations Committee. And Dan Stein and I had a Zoom with him. And we learned that Larry has more than 30 years of international trade experience in China and Taiwan. And Taiwan came up quite often during that hour for us. He is the founder of his own import, export, and consulting business. And the consulting aspect of his company assists U.S. small businesses entering into and overcoming the hurdles of the China and Taiwan markets. His company also advises non-government associations in China on business and trade issues. He is the vice co-chair of the New York District Export Council. He speaks, reads, and writes fluent Mandarin and has lived both in China and Taiwan. And I believe, Larry, you invited Dan and me both to New York.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Without a doubt. And you know what? In New York, you can get some great Chinese food as well.
Oh, well, that sounds great right now. I had a granola bar. We're just a little while ago. So Larry is in New York and works as an adjunct assistant professor at New York University's School of Professional Studies and at the State University of New York's Fashion Institute of Technology. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on international business and international trade. He is a frequent speaker to various business, academic, and civic institutions, including the China Institute, Columbia University, the Fashion Institute of Technology's Talking Trade events, New York University, Citibank, HSBC, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and the Connecticut China Business Council on topics of international trade and the business environment in China. So that is my brief introduction of Larry. Dan and I were just so impressed. We thought it would be a great follow-up for our group to listen and talk with Larry. Larry, I'm going to leave the stage here and just take the microphone with me. And so whenever anyone has a question here, I'll give them the microphone even though you can't see them. We are recording this presentation so we can share it on our public access channel as well.
Okay, well, wonderful, Naomi. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I just wish I could actually be in Iowa. But hopefully in the future I'll have the opportunity. Sort of my goal really is to just make this as informal and just a discussion and open it up to questions from all of you. But I just wanted to give you a little bit more of a background about myself and then make a couple of observations on what Matt and Ryan and Ling Ling had to say in that really wonderful presentation. And the only addition to what Naomi described about me, which was rather kind, is I was lucky enough that I've been able to see China as it's emerged and developed over the years. In fact, I first went to China in 1982. So that's, and I've, as Naomi said, I've lived in China and Taiwan. I've traveled, oh, probably, besides living there, probably close to 100 times to China, if not more. So I have witnessed a lot of the changes. And again, when I first went to China in 1982, basically, there were no automobiles. People did not have phones. It was an emerging economy. Now, and I think Naomi mentioned a few of you have been to China very recently, the big cities are, in certain respects, as far as infrastructure, far more advanced than the infrastructure in the United States. And having just been stuck on the New York subway, I can attest to that. Um, so it's really remarkable the changes that China has really undergone over the past really 40 some odd years. And I will go to cities that I hadn't been to in years, and I will sort of scratch my head and say, was I really in this city 30 years ago? Because it looks entirely different, um, which is mostly for the good. And most Chinese cities have been in their development. I can't say this about all Chinese cities, but many Chinese cities have tried to preserve their history. I can't say that about all Chinese cities, but some have. So it's really the changes, at least superficially in China, over the 4 decades that I've been going are pretty dramatic. But I did make the observation that I think the changes, at least on the surface, are really dramatic. The question is the changes that have under whether the changes have been as significant underneath the surface, and that's probably open to debate. I really, Alexiana, I thought that was an excellent question that you posed just about people-to-people exchanges and the impact it would have. And I think I really agree with what Matt and Ryan and said that one of the areas that to facilitate exchanges and hopefully they continue is at the state or provincial level and at the municipal level, the city to city, the sister city arrangements. And that's where I think that one can maybe overcome some of the obstacles that have been posed, that are imposed by the deterioration of relationships. Not to focus unduly on business, but I do find a couple of comments I would like to make. Much has been talked about, just getting off China for a second and just the overall trade environment. President Trump talks about the trade deficit that the United States runs in the aggregate. But what is often left out of that discussion is our trade numbers consist of two components: goods or merchandise, stuff that's imported and exported, but also services. And in the service part of trade, the United States runs a surplus. So we are a net exporter of services. We are a net importer. I should say we are net. We run a surplus in services, in the export of services. We run a deficit in trade of goods. And what's interesting, if you go back to 1960, and you look at the data for 1960, it was just the opposite. The United States ran a trade surplus in goods and a trade deficit in services. And now in 2025, and for a much longer period than that, it's the opposite. We run a surplus in services and a deficit in goods. And that I think sort of underscores the evolution of the U.S. economy. That we certainly make things, but we are less of an industrial society or economics, and we are more of a service economy. And it may be, and I talk to a lot of manufacturers in my business, and it may be an unrealistic goal to think that we can onshore a lot of manufacturing again. Um, and maybe what we should be focusing on is that where we have a competitive advantage amongst things in services. What I'm afraid to see, and the data is released every month, is whether that service surplus is going to start shrinking, because clearly there's going to be a decline of inbound students, which international students coming to the United States is a trade. It's counterintuitive, but it is a trade. It is a trade export, a service export when a student comes here. Likewise, tourism. And I think there will probably be a decline in inbound tourism to the United States. And that's going to start shrinking our, the services number in the surplus. And I think is going to be an unfortunate outcome of what's transpiring right now. And we'll see the U.S. data is kind of slow, so March data will be released, should be next Friday on May 2nd, and then April will be released in June. And I think you will see a shrinking of the service surplus as unfortunately an outgrowth of this. Interestingly enough, this morning when I was in class, I have one of my students is an international student from India, and I asked her if a lot of her friends were still considering coming to study in the United States, and she said to the contrary, many of them were reevaluating coming here, and instead were exploring the other options: Canada, Australia, and Singapore in particular. And that that has a profound effect, not just on universities, but on all downstream economic activity as a result of international students. So I think it's an unfortunate outgrowth. So I think maybe if you would all like to pose some questions to me, or if you'd like for me to elaborate a little bit further on China, specifically whether it's on the trade or economic or cultural or political front, I'm happy to sort of have this as sort of a Q&A. Naomi,
Yes.
or you wish me?
Yep. Yep. Larry, I do have a question here.
Sure.
This is Sarah Landy, and maybe Sarah, just describe a little bit about your connection with China too. But she also has a question. I know you
Okay,
can't see her
great,
well on the screen.
great.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights. I think they were very wise. And it's a special time in Iowa. We wish you were with us, but we're
I really wish I
celebrating
were.
the 40th anniversary of the visit
Yes.
of Xi Jinping
Yes.
to Iowa. And that's a celebration going on tonight. And I guess how I am, I was one of the people that he hosted him
Mhm.
in my home at that time, and that relationship has continued. And
Wonderful.
we have strong people to people relationships. And I thought that wasn't really brought up in that first group of people. I don't think they experienced it. And another follow-up sort of question with that in mind is, do you think our government officials, and well, probably most of the ones that were on the panel, have experienced China today, or do its past, that somehow it seems, I wonder if they have, or if they have seen China, certainly it's the communists, but how they've grown in their cities, and their children are so well educated, and they have way more engineers than we do. So I wouldn't count them out. So I'm sort of rattling to bring you a little up to date on Iowa,
Right.
but you might comment on that to see if the people making decisions today have experience down in the cultural level, past maybe the import level and so forth.
Well, first of all, I am incredibly envious of you for having had the opportunity to be I'm sure you're such a gracious host, and that you can maintain that relationship. So I'm really jealous. And it's really a tribute, I'm sure, to you and to I will say this, to American hospitality, or Iowa hospitality as well, which maybe we can learn a little bit here in New York about. And it's funny because that evokes memories for me because when I grew up and when I first went to China, when there was a lot less business interaction, and you might remember this, there used to be something called the U.S. China People's Friendship Association, which was meant to spur people-to-people contact as a way of developing a more robust relationship. And that's obviously a bit of an anachronism. I was thinking whether it even exists right now. I suspect those organizations are a thing of the past. To address your question, I mean, I do know a little bit about Ryan Haas, and he is, most people in these positions are what are known as China hands. So they, and they were probably, or I might say someone like me as well, we were ones would be described as a China nerd. We had a fascination with China, and and a tremendous admiration for Chinese history, for Chinese culture. So I think they do have that. And I'm speaking particularly about Ryan Haas because I do know that. Matt Turbin, I can't speak for, but I think what happens is once you become in a position, a diplomatic position, unfortunately, you don't have the opportunities. You may have had the opportunities, but you don't have the opportunities for that informal contact with the Labaixing in Chinese, with ordinary people. And I don't know if you remember this, but having said that, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of anecdotal information. When Janet Yellen went to Beijing, the average Chinese person was fascinated because she went to a local restaurant and wanted to experience local cuisine, and she insisted upon. She had the diplomatic staff find, places they would go with their friends. And again, I'm not sure if you ever saw this video. Do you remember the former U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke? I'm not sure if it rings a name. When there is a very famous video of him and his wife and children when they were at I think at the airport in Seattle, and they were flying out back to Beijing. And Gary Locke went out and bought a cup of coffee. And Chinese people were fascinated that here is, such a high-ranking official that he himself is walking around with a backpack buying coffee for he and his wife, as opposed to having officials do it for him. And that sort of informal nature of American society actually resonated with Chinese people, who are not used to, they're used to seeing their officials all dressed formally and being somewhat, in reflecting a little bit the hierarchical nature of society. They were very impressed with that. So I in defense of both Ryan and Matt, I think they do they have experienced China.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I've answered the question. I do think they've experienced China.
Well, that's good. Well, I was there in '84 too, so.
Wow, I probably ran into you.
Yeah, I know. So that's enough about me. But
So in 1984, you can attest that everyone rode a bicycle. There were no mobile phones. No one had a phone. And then you may recall at that point when there were two types of currencies, right? There was the foreign exchange notes and local currency, and local people were not allowed into hotels where Westerners were staying. If you had a guest, you would have to go get them to bring them into a hotel. So it's evolved quite a bit in the 40 some odd years.
I would like to follow up with that. So my name's Krista Regenetter, and I was recently in China last month with 85 students that we took over to Shijiazhuang. Shijiazhuang
right.
Foreign Language School is our sister school. And one of the things that I'm a little worried about, because I agree with you 100% that like the sister city relationships, the sister school relationships are where we can continue the people-to-people exchange. But I noticed Ohio, I think it's Ohio, passed a law where they're saying that there can be no governmental like sister city, such as schools, any government entity cannot have a sister relationship in China. And I'm just curious if, like, I've been paying attention to that. Like, is this going to be something that is going to spread, through the Republican dominated states, which Iowa is also. And I don't know if you had heard any other rumblings of that kind of philosophy to limit those kind of relationships.
Well, I haven't heard that again, being in a, and I hate to politicize everything, but it being in a Democratic state, um, I haven't heard that. But the one thing I would say eh, to that, if that is a trend, and hopefully it's not in Iowa, and hopefully Iowans see the benefit of, you're an agricultural state, you do export quite a bit. That if that does, I think, and I've talked, because I'm both in the business world and the academic world, that's where I think, colleges and universities can play a proactive role, and talk about the benefits that accrue from exchanges, the exchange of students, and pointed out that communication is better than non-communication, certainly. And and one of the things I have said when people will sometimes say, well, the only beneficiaries of international students are colleges and universities, that's not true, because it is all the economic, as I mentioned earlier, all the economic activity that is created by international students, whether it's, international students buy things here, they spend money, their friends come over, their family members come over. All of that is beneficial beyond simply the university community. But to sort of rebut the idea of no longer having these government to government exchanges, I mean, I think that's something where the universities should might be able to step up and be an advocate for all the benefits of it.
I have another question, but does anybody else have a question? So, you were talking about the services, and I think that that's like a really important thing that's missing from the conversation, right? And I would think that entertainment is another place where the U.S. has been a huge exporter. But when I was in China last month, there were some folks who were very excited to show me a trailer of the first Chinese animated full-length movie. And so and like visiting the universities, like it just seems like their technology is really advanced, and that's not just superficial, but that they've kind of taken the learnings from their students who've studied all over the world and have created an industry. And I'm curious if you think that we're also going to be losing some ground maybe in that entertainment space and other service areas and it's not just China. I think a lot of countries are starting to create their own content in ways that the US used to dominate.
Well, the one thing I would say about that, and this is where now I'll come down, I don't want to be harsh, but I'll come down a little bit critical of China, because they do limit the amount of films, Hollywood films in China. They do, if we're looking at that part of entertainment, there is, let's face it, it is a state-run economy, a state-run society. There are topics that are off limits, such that so it's not that it's an entirely wide open market in the entertainment field as it is. But having said that, I think my general concern is that the United States is going to lose its dominance in the service sector in general, not just with China, but with the world. And there a lot of, and again, that is where our strengths are, and I think we're just shooting ourselves in the foot, unfortunately. But again, China in the field of entertainment, it's not an entirely wide open market. The interesting thing, as we're speaking, what I'm thinking about, though, one subject that didn't come up in the discussion is intellectual property rights, IPR. And you see less, not that there isn't, pirated stuff in China, but you actually see less of it. And you see, Western companies Western brands, whether it's in apparel, whether it's in software, whatever, there are in pharmaceuticals, there is actually less complaints about it. Not to say that it's a perfect regime, but China has to an extent addressed IPR. Now, my own personal view of the IPR issue is they have been more robust in their application of the law, because I think intellectual property theft is starting to hurt Chinese entities. And when it starts to hurt Chinese entities, I think they I don't want to say they care less, but they're less concerned about the harm done to Western entities. But when it starts to hurt their own indigenous businesses, then they tend to have a greater commitment to the application of intellectual property rights. I mean, when was the last time you heard about an issue in IPR? It's been a while.
I have a follow up on that. You know, how do you feel, having been in China and the US, about the big disparity in capability in what engineers say with semiconductors and things, that we do it here, but are they not, with all their science and their effort of their government priority, quite strong competitors, or or I'll just leave it there.
Well, I'm going to qualify my answer by saying I am certainly not an expert on the subject matter, and I'll defer a little bit to what both Matt and Ryan said, that they are still, they are not at the level that we are, and it may be that they have years to go, and the reason I do wonder about that, but then I'll qualify my answer, is certainly Xi Jinping, certainly what, 10 years ago, launched this China 2025 plan, and where they expected to dominate in a number of fields, and they have not yet achieved that. So its question is, will the U.S. dominance remain? There is an alternative argument to export controls, which was not brought up in the first hour, which is, by having such stringent export controls, are we forcing China to have no choice but to do even more to reach the level of the United States? That they feel that they must develop their own sophisticated technologies because they don't have access to it here. So is what we are doing by having such strict export controls on semiconductors to China, are we just encouraging them to do all that they can to equal or surpass us? And I can't answer that question definitively, but that is something that I think should be considered. And there are some people who say that's exactly what U.S. policy, and it's not just President Trump, it's also President Biden. President Trump started it, President Biden continued it, and President Trump has, reinvigorated it. So I'm not sure what the answer is to that on that.
So you talked about working with a lot of Chinese business people. So I'm assuming you kind of have your ear to the ground of some of their opinions about the world right now. But I have a friend that's at the celebration in Des Moines, and she sent me a note that the consulate general, kind of his sentiment tonight has been that he hopes the U.S. will return to a rational path. And the consulate general was actually in Muscatine in January. We hosted a Model United Nations conference where we had Chinese youth and Iowa youth together for that opportunity. And the consulate general, I felt like his message was really with excitement about Xi and Trump working together, and kind of, like here we are, and so it's only been a few short months, and it sounds like he has a very different message tonight. And I'm just curious, have you seen a shift in maybe some of your Chinese business partners or that industry in where they think we're at?
Well, I would say, there's always the party line, and people will say the party line. And then when you have the opportunity to speak with people off the record and in settings, and I will say this much, now to paint a little bit of maybe the less pleasant side of China. Um, China's surveillance abilities is pretty profound. So, people are hesitant, um, to express themselves. Often, if I have a conversation, I may just go for a walk in the park. In Beijing, there's a particular park. I'll go for, because I feel relatively safe having an honest discussion with somebody there. If it's in an office, I will not have that discussion because one just never knows. And I may be overly cautious, but I will say I've been going to China for a number of years, um, and I see that. Now I will say I'm going to say the other side of it. And I was in China just very briefly in January, um, and in fact just um, before President Trump was inaugurated. So, there is under the surface, there is, or there is, not a real comfortableness with Xi Jinping and the state of the economy and his leadership. Um, then that is pretty, I would say, fairly transparent. What I'm concerned about right now is that, always under the surface, Chinese people are extremely proud, deservedly so, very nationalistic, and the party does have the ability to whip up, and the nice way to say it, the diplomatic way to say it is nationalism, at a higher level, xenophobia. And you can, if you look back, you can see instances with Japanese, with Korean, with French, targeting things. And I'm actually, concerned about that aspect of it as well. And in fact, I think the United States, often I think that the United States policy sort of missed this undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the fact that basically Xi appointed himself as, emperor, and that the state of the economy, basically. And the economy is not good. I mean, I don't know what your experience is, what you saw in Shijiazhuang, but the economy is not great. And you just have to look, even if you just use retail sales as a measure, and you can see evidence of it.
I think for my experiences, the trips have always been very focused on the people to people and youth to youth.
Mm,
So like
mm,
we don't get insights into that kind of thing because it's really
right,
about kids meeting kids and
right. Mm,
spending time together and exploring Chinese culture and getting to know each other. So um, we purposely kind of stay away from that kind of thing because that's not the purpose of
right,
the
right,
trips.
right.
And so it's really so my view is definitely been skewed in that
Mm,
I'm just seeing like teenagers be teenagers together and then kind of are be surprised that they're not more different because
yeah,
um
exactly. Well,
I
yeah,
think so it's been very good in that way but we try to make sure that any kind of political or anything like that is not a part of our
right.
conversation so I don't get to see that side of things so it's
Mm,
interesting to hear you share
mm,
some of those insights
right.
because
But
it's not a
you
part of
know,
the
one of the interesting things, January of 2024. This was the one thing that struck me, which I was disappointed to see. Usually when I travel, I'll usually go to Taiwan first, and then I'll fly to Beijing. And normally, the airport in Taipei is not terribly busy, and Beijing is absolutely bustling. In January of 24, when I flew from Taipei to Beijing. I was shocked at how empty the airport was in Beijing. It wasn't deserted, but it wasn't the usual bustling self. Um, and when I flew out back to Taipei, I had an evening flight a few days later. the airport in Beijing was eerily empty. And one of the things it's rare in China now that you say that it's eerily devoid of people, right? That's not something one would normally associate with China. And these couple of times, and it was actually the same way this January for me. And it was what was the other striking thing to me is and hopefully it's changed, that there were a lot less foreigners in China. Granted, maybe with a group you may not see that, but there were a lot less foreigners, which is also not a great out. I don't like to see that.
One thing I've noticed over just the past, year and a half that we've been
Mm.
assisting is that like for foreigners to spend money in China has become much easier very rapidly. Like,
Yes.
in January of 2024, it was still very difficult to figure out,
Yep.
how we could purchase things and it's between Alipay and WeChat. It's become
Right.
much easier for foreigners to be able to spend money. But I also
Yep.
think they opened up a new international airport in
Yes.
Beijing.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
we flew into the new one this time.
Oh.
So
Great.
yeah, so it's interesting. I wonder if that had any impact too.
Well, it's funny what people will say. When I express that to um, people in Beijing, they'll say, "Oh, that's because the other airport. That's why." Um, but everyone hates the other airport because it's really far. Unless
Yeah.
yeah, it's really far. And then, look, I don't want to dismiss that. There's probably some truth to that. But most of the international flights and Taipei is a semi-international flight, but most international flights are out of Beijing Capital Airport, and and many domestic flights, and it was just noticeable how much less traffic there, it was. So, but on the other hand, I mean, China's made it easier. I think there's 72-hour visa-less travel they have. And again, when I think about China in 1982 and now, it's literally two different worlds. Just two. I mean, that airport it was unimaginable in 1982.
And that's what I hear a lot of the chaperones, because I think,
Mm.
when we were educated growing up, that's the view of China that we
Yes.
received,
Mm.
and then they go and they chaperone these trips and they're just like, oh my gosh, when they see the cities, and
Right.
the
Right.
high-speed trains and just, all of
Mm.
it, it's kind of a shocking development for folks sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And even from the business perspective, the infrastructure. I mean, the ports, the roads. I mean, again, the high speed, the expressways. None of that was there 20 years ago. The high speed rail. I mean, and many people prefer to travel high speed rail than even fly. Dealing with security at airports, etc. The subways in so many cities, which didn't exist. Of course, the amount of automobiles. So all of that, the changes really are remarkable. And unfortunately, what's happened right now is we're reviewing, and I don't know how from an American point of view, how one classifies China. Are they a strategic competitor? What? And one of the questions I think that was probably missing from this evening, from a geopolitical perspective, is what exactly is the United States policy towards China? I don't think anyone from the current administration has articulated that. And what is our goal? And I think that's been absent for President Trump's first 100 days. What exactly is the desired outcome with China? And I will say this much: you're not going to, President Trump says he's the master negotiator. I don't think you can be a successful negotiator with your Chinese counterparts by embarrassing them, or by lecturing them. That is not the way to succeed. So I'm not sure who's guiding him in China's strategy, but that's not the way to succeed. And I can't. I mean, I'm not sure if you saw press reports yesterday where allegedly President Trump was going to reduce some of the tariffs. And then the Minister of Commerce said, no, we've had no discussions with the Trump administration. So, that's another thing. That's another, again, why are you putting these things out which are inaccurate? That's not going to facilitate a resolution of what's going on right now. I mean, again, I think the best resolution is the things that universities doing, which are, people to people exchanges. And, maybe being a naive American, I've always felt, and at NYU, we have a lot of Chinese students. I've always felt that, we are, education is also part of our soft power. And so that, people in the mainland, look, they do live under the rule of the Communist Party, and I'm not, the Communist Party has accomplished quite a bit. It may not be, I'm not going to comment what's best for Chinese people, but at least that they have the opportunity to compare. And that's what education does. And by restricting the inbound flow of students, I think is a terrible mistake.
I don't know if he has a wrap up, or I was just
One last question, Larry. Yeah.
Of course.
wrap up his. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned soft power. This is what we see China really has, whether it's the Belt and Road or the Xi Jinping bringing 50,000 students to China. The many students from here have gone. So it's interesting that we feel the soft power and have built deep friendships. I'm sort of comparing soft power, and I'm going to just not answer anymore. And I want to hear your wrap up too, because
Okay.
now even from the embassy staff, they say to us, what's the one thing that we could do for you to build a better relationships? And if you say something, they do it. So it's yeah. So anyway,
Well, I think you should be appointed. You should be appointed U.S. ambassador to China. That would solve everything.
But we care for the best of both, and
Of
I'd like
course.
to have you wrap up. We're running out of time.
Okay.
So.
Well, Larry, thank you so much. If you have any closing comments that you want us to, leave with, this is your time to do so.
Well, again, one of the things just to focus again on the issue of soft power, and again, the possibility of what you mentioned about the state to province or sister to sister relationships. I think that's again a profound mistake, and I think that's where universities can play a role in as best they can, advocating for that, and maybe continuing the exchange of students as you described. That's one thing. And just in general, I would say that both sides, they're just looking at the overall environment right now. I think the United States, I think the United States misjudges China on one other point, which is I think there's the belief that in this quote trade war, China is in a weaker position, and China is more dependent on the U.S. than the U.S. is on China, and that's just looking at that yes, China has an export economy, but I think they're in sort of what you all were saying. I think we, or the current administration, underestimates Chinese ability. In Chinese would be neng ku, which is to swallow bitterness. And they will, if Xi Jinping makes it sort of, builds up Chinese nationalism, and this is a long-term struggle, that will resonate with a lot of Chinese people. And Americans, we tend to be a little bit lazy and soft. So I think we underestimate. I think we have to be careful and not underestimate China's ability to go the long haul if we don't find that off ramp. So and Naomi, really, it's been a pleasure to speak here. And actually, I wish I could have come out. As I said, I'd love to come out to Iowa sometime.
You received an invitation from Sarah
Okay.
Landy, the one and
Okay.
only Larry. So, well, we're thankful to have this opportunity. I'm glad we got connected through the committee, and
Yep.
the one thing that maybe would have added is having you here in person, Larry. But this was the second best,
Okay.
just to really talk through and learn from your
Yep.
experiences. We're thankful that you agreed to visit with us,
Oh,
and
my
thank
pleasure. My pleasure.
yeah.
Naomi, one other
Oh,
thing,
hold on,
if you, I was going to say, Naomi, one other thing is I'd be happy. Maybe I'll just email it to you, or you can share my email. Or for those of you who have WeChat, I'm happy to share my WeChat as well.
Oh, sure. Yes, that would be
So,
great. One
so,
last word
so,
from Sarah, Larry.
yes, please go ahead, Sarah.
And I think you're with the council. The person that planned the first delegation, including Xi Jinping's father
Mm.
to Iowa, was Jan Barris.
Ah,
You know
yes.
her. Yeah,
Yep.
she's still there at the
Yep.
council, and I've seen her,
Yep.
but
Yep.
yeah.
She's a great, she's a real China hand and has a true admiration for Chinese
Thanks,
culture and
yeah.
Chinese people.
And she and Sarah are friends.
Oh,
Yes,
wonderful. Wonderful.
yes, yes. All right, Larry, have a good night.
So
We will,
you
I
as
will be
well.
in New York soon.
I look forward to seeing you in New York.
Thank
It's
you
been a
very much.
pleasure.
Good
Okay.
night.
You all have a good evening.